Welcome to all of you who have chosen to join us here in the Nordic Pavilion for this session, and also a warm welcome to all of you who are attending online. So the green transition is a must. But what role does soil play in this transition? And can farmers and foresters be at the forefront of the green transition? So these are the questions which we will focus upon during these coming 45 minutes. And here today in the Nordic Pavilion, we decided to put soil carbon sequestration on the agenda. And the reason for this is that increasing carbon storage in soil is actually one of the most cost-effective climate measures. And a measure which also has other positive impacts on very crucial aspects, such as, for example, biodiversity and soil fertility. But what does soil carbon sequestration actually mean? And how can we move from awareness to action? My name is Maria Thunberg, and I'm working with the Nordic collaboration bodies Nordic Forest Research and Nordic Agri Research. And I will guide you through this session here today and evolve these questions together with you. And together with me here today, I have a number of excellent speakers. So I'm very happy to say that we have Dr. Elisa Vaino from the Finnish initiative Carbon Action, an initiative that was actually nominated to the Nordic Environment Prize this year, so congratulations to that. We also have Dr. Lera Miles from the Climate Change and Biodiversity Program, so most welcome to you. And you will tell us a little bit about the global patterns of soil carbon in relation to biodiversity. And I know you will also touch upon the role of peatlands. And we also have a distinguished panel here next to me. So we have Mr. Per Holmgren, you're from the European Parliament, and we have Ms. Annika Hirvonen from the Nordic Council, and I'm also very happy to say that we have Kristun Frostadotter from the Icelandic Parliament. So most welcome to all of you. But before we kick off these different presentations, I would like to put this topic a little bit into context. So, as we all know, emissions of carbon dioxide are mainly arising from anthropogenic activities, such as the consumption of fossil fuels, deforestation, but also farming. However, depending on how we actually use the land and how we use the soil, it can both contribute to emissions, but also in terms of saving carbon in the soil. And when the carbon is stored in soil, in arable or forest soils, we talk about carbon sinks. And these sinks, they store the carbon and thus mitigate climate change, whilst also providing these other positive benefits, such as the increasing of soil fertility or indeed biodiversity. And perhaps because of this, soil carbon has become an important aspect in the debate, both on how to use forest and arable land, but also in terms of how to actually meet the climate targets. It is, however, a challenging landscape for policymakers to navigate. And one reason for this challenge is this very close link between soil carbon and other perspectives, other policy areas, such as already mentioned, questions about biodiversity, but we also have questions regarding production economics, for example, or indeed the climate change aspects. So these linkages between the different policy areas forces policymakers to do some trade-offs and balance potential goal conflicts. And also, in addition to this, we have a continuously evolving knowledge about soil as a carbon sink. And for present, we also have several sort of scientific knowledge gaps. There are much more to learn. And this also contributes to creating these tough conditions in which to design effective policy measures. And there are a range of very interesting policy-related questions in attachment to soil as a carbon sink. For example, how can we set ambitious targets and credible targets when we talk about land use change and forest, or LULUCF? Or for example, how can we bring better incentives to both foresters and farmers in increasing the carbon in soils? So this could perhaps be different certification schemes or carbon credits, etc. And I'd like also to mention that there are several very interesting initiatives in this field ongoing worldwide. And one of them that I like to mention is the 4 per mil initiative, which we will soon hear a little bit more about. And there are also several Nordic actors engaged in this field. For example, the Nordic Forest Research, Nordic Agri-Research, and the Nordic Council of Ministers Working Group for Climate and Air have during the last year facilitated knowledge development and knowledge transfer between policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. So bringing these different groups together to discuss how we can move sort of from theoretical knowledge to practical action, and how we can learn from practice and improve the research field. So on that note, I am very proud to present our first speaker for today, and I would like to welcome Dr. Elisa Vainio from Carbon Action to the stage. And you will tell us a little bit about what Carbon Action is and what it is you're doing within this initiative.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you for introduction, and thank you for inviting us here, the Carbon Action Initiative and Baltic Sea Action Group. So my name is Elisa Vainio, and I work as a project manager in the Baltic Sea Action Group. I will give you a short introduction to this platform that we have. First of all, this is really action. We are bringing together farmers, scientists, companies and decision makers to work together to increase the regenerative farming processes that are used in general. And farmers are involved in these carbon action projects in a way that there are 100 pilot farms where the research is done on how the carbon is sequestrated in the soil. Then farmers are also joining this free online course for learning regenerative farming. And there is plenty of freely available information in one place that this platform collects. So it's a huge info bank for farmers and everyone interested. Then we have researchers working together with farmers and learning together with farmers. We have 21 different research projects in this platform. They are focusing on different soil and plant processes, farming practices, and how the carbon gets stored into the soil. What to mention here also that we have this field observatory in which we have the world first forecast on carbon sequestration in the soil. Then companies are involved in all these projects and in this platform. We have in total 11 companies at the moment, and they are training their contract farmers. They are developing their sourcing criteria, and also they bring the regenerative products into the markets. Then we have decision makers involved together with the other stakeholder groups, and of course we aim that with these actions already taking place, it will ultimately lead to a better climate and agriculture policies, as well as efficient and fair carbon markets. As I mentioned, we have this online data website, which is called Field Observatory. This shows the real-time carbon sequestration in our study sites, and also here is the world first carbon sequestration forecast. So the plan is that this carbon sequestration forecast could be similar as a weather forecast, so we can have like 10 days ahead forecasting how much carbon is getting stored in the soil. And it's very important part here in the whole carbon action and in this platform and this initiative to have this scientific verification, because all these different groups that are involved, they are very interested and eager to know if this regenerative farming is actually leading to more carbon in the soil. So farmers and companies, they really want to know that these management practices are actually working. And of course, when I talk about carbon storage in the soil and regenerative farming, we are not aiming only towards increasing carbon in the soils. We are also aiming for healthy soils in general, and that means increasing biodiversity, and it also means better resilience for the yields. It's also good for the soil and for the farmers, the carbon and biodiversity. So it's really multi-beneficial. And this research that is done in the platform, the Finnish Meteorological Institute is coordinating the research, while the Baltic Sea Action Group is coordinating the platform in general. Then, as I mentioned, we have a free online course on regenerative farming. This is open to everyone interested in, and it's now available in Finnish and Swedish. This is really beneficial that we have a lot of materials also in Swedish, because it's really beneficial for the increasing Nordic collaboration, and we have already started a strong collaboration with Svensk Kolinlagring from Sweden, which is quite similar platform than Carbon Action. They are doing a lot of similar things, and we have a strong collaboration with them. So it's really useful to have not only this online course, but also other material, both in Finnish and Swedish. Our aim is to have this at some point in English also. Of course, we are targeting to many different languages. And at the moment we have approximately 1,000 registered in this course. Then here in Glasgow, we are at the moment not only in this event, but also we are presenting carbon action in this 4 per mil initiative day. The 4 per mil initiative is it aims to increase the soil carbon storages 4 per mil per year. So annual growth of the storages 4 per mil. And there at the moment is going to high-level segment where our content director Laura Höjer is speaking, and then I will be presenting shortly an upcoming meeting this afternoon, so stay tuned. It's going to be in 2023 and very much related to healthy soils and carbon storaging and regenerative farming. So it's going to be launched this afternoon. And of course, at the same time, there is this sister event of this event where carbon action is even more throughoutly presented. So if you are more interested in that, then you can watch the streaming, the video recording later. It's coming from this sister hub in Helsinki, this Nordic hub. And this can be also followed in Zoom. So we thank all our funders, and you can follow our work in Twitter and web pages and also in Instagram. But I would say that this answer to the question, can the farmers be at the forefront, is definitely yes, because we are doing this in action all the time as we speak here. Thank you.
Was really exciting to see, and that we also had this very clear, yes, farmers can be at the forefront, and you have this field observatory and this very active farming community, it seems, in this question. I'm now happy to hand over the word to Mr. Per Holmgren. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective and from the European Parliament perspective, what are your thoughts on this topic and what you heard from Dr. Vaino here?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I really have to stress that this is one of the few things that can actually give me some hope for the future, because when involved in different discussions and debates here at the COP26, it's so obvious that we will need a huge amount of negative emissions, carbon sequestration during this century. And there are people hoping for some sort of high technological development, maybe in the latter half of this century. But here and now, the only way that we can sequester carbon from the atmosphere is in the soil and of course also in the forestry. Sometime during meetings like this, I wear this pin or whatever you should call it. It's a measurement of how much carbon dioxide we actually have in the atmosphere at the moment. It's 415 now in November. This year it was 412 just 1 year ago. And I would like to remind you that the safe level according to planetary boundaries when it comes to carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is 350. And I think really that we often forget about this. We're discussing 1.5 degrees, we're discussing 2 degrees, but in the end it's about how much carbon dioxide will be in the atmosphere once this feast of oil and carbon and fossil energy is over. And we need to stabilize at a much, much lower level than we are today. And once again, if we are to focus on that here and now, during this decade and the next decade, it is definitely in farming and soil, and also, of course, when it comes to forestry. But from a European Parliament perspective, I'm a full member in ENVI and also substitute in Agri. So this meeting of climate and biodiversity, agriculture, forestry is really my core issues. But I have to say, unfortunately, that the committee in Agri is one of the most depressing places I've ever been to. It's hugely conservative, and they don't want to see this transformation of agricultural techniques in Europe. We are still giving away money mainly in ways of keeping the heavily industrialized farming from the end of the last century and from the beginning of this one. And as a green MEP, I really try to focus that we need to push this money into farming and forestry that really focus on ecosystem services like this. This summer I visited a Swedish farmer focusing on regenerative farming. You can find it at my Facebook. It's of course in Swedish, but I know a lot of you can at least understand Swedish. It was a very, very optimistic meeting I had with this guy in Västergötland in Sweden. I think it's one of the biggest regenerative farms in Sweden. And once again, this is a way that we need to go, and we need to focus even more now during this decade and the next decade to have this big transition into a sustainable farming where we really have focus on soil quality, ecosystem services, biodiversity, really how the soil, the quality of the soil, you know, those kind of things that were obvious and so central for a farmer maybe 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But now it's been this shift towards high technology and bigger farms and less biodiversity. And unfortunately, that is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity and also, unfortunately, to climate. Whereas, just as you perfectly demonstrated, instead of being a threat to climate, it could be one of the core solutions. So that's my most important things anyhow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holmgren. And I think that puts it very nicely into perspective, right? An applause.
Thank you.
So both seeing the challenges on a policy level, but also, if I understand you correctly, being really thrilled about these practitioners making action and using soil in a good way in terms of climate mitigation. Thank you so much. I would now like to welcome Dr. Lera Miles to the stage, and you're a Principal Technical Specialist at the Climate Change and Biodiversity Program in the UK. And You're here to tell us a little bit about these global patterns of soil carbon and also this connection or relation to biodiversity. And you will also touch upon the role of peatlands, I know, which are important in this
That's right.
consideration. And we will see if we can get someone to help us with changing the PowerPoint into Lyra's PowerPoint. Let's see if we can get someone from the communications team.
I should just start off by introducing myself a little bit more. I work for an organisation called the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, which I know is quite a mouthful, which is the UN's Biodiversity Centre. And I've been privileged to work with UNEP and IUCN on nature-based solutions. We've recently been reviewing what the global potential for nature-based solutions might look like, including the place of agriculture. So I'll start off, when I get a slide, by talking a little bit about that. I think that's the end of the previous slide.
We need a next presentation, please.
Thank you, sir. There we go, that's me.
Excellent. Now you got your slides underway.
Thank you, sir. So, moving rapidly on. We know that nature-based solutions are needed if we're going to achieve a net zero target by 2050. And we know that if we're going to manage to get in under 1.5 degrees increasing global temperature rise, we do need that net zero target to be achieved. And clearly that means urgent decarbonisation across the global economy. But IPCC scenarios tell us that land-based mitigation options are an essential part of that. And we feel that nature-based solutions involving protecting, restoring, better managing all of our ecosystems are the best way to go about this. The formal definition of nature-based solutions is that they are actions to protect, sustainably manage or restore any kind of ecosystem, so natural and modified ecosystems, that they address societal challenges efficiently and adaptively, and that they do deliver benefits for human well-being and for biodiversity. So if you're wondering whether something does qualify as nature-based solution, you have these different points to bear in mind. And our review has concluded that the global mitigation potential is at least 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030, and at least 10 by 2050. It could be much more than that, but it depends how quickly we're able to scale up. We know we need time to make sure that things are well planned and that safeguards are deployed. So, turning quickly to soils, to better understand what the global potential looks like and how that global potential is distributed, it really helps to have some spatial data. And this map here is based on, initially, work by Tom Henkel and colleagues to map soil organic carbon, and then we've taken IPCC defaults and some other data sets to get to an understanding of how much of that soil organic carbon would be vulnerable to human activity, especially through conventional agriculture. So it's not saying that all this carbon is right now under pressure, but if you were going to be conducting conventional agriculture in these places, that's the distribution of the carbon stocks at risk. If you're going to be undertaking planning in a particular place, clearly you need national data if you're doing national or subnational planning, but the global maps are useful for giving us an idea of what the global potential is and how it's distributed across the world. Similarly, we can look at biodiversity in the same kind of a way, and you might notice that the patterns we're seeing for this particular biodiversity and soil carbon map are pretty different. That's partly a consequence of the biodiversity metric that I've chosen, which is rarity-weighted species richness. So it's showing you places that are important for narrow-range species, which are particular parts of the world, and sometimes those are convergent with places of high soil carbon. So this is telling us that when we want to be having policy and planning to simultaneously achieve biodiversity benefits, reduce extinction risk, we need to be, and to conserve soil carbon, we need to be paying particular attention to those places. And nature-based solutions done well can deliver these multiple benefits for biodiversity, for carbon, for other societal challenges, but that does require understanding what's an appropriate action to take in what place to deliver what benefits. It needs planning, design, and monitoring. So we prepared a synthesis looking across these various different studies at 2030 and 2050, each of which had tried to understand what the potential for nature-based solutions is in a way that didn't simultaneously try to take the same action in the same place. So they've all made a good effort at having a comprehensive study, and you can see they've come to some different kinds of results here. Partly that's because of different assumptions about how much it's possible to spend on nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation. So what your cost per tonne is gives you a different kind of an answer. And partly it is about the number of different options that have been integrated and the speed of scaling up that's assumed. But looking across the figures, we find that grasslands and agriculture, actions to better manage our grasslands and agriculture and to protect natural grasslands, represent about 24% of the solution. And then additionally, in peatlands, which often are forests or grasslands, there is an additional potential of about 10% of the total climate change mitigation potential from actions to better look after our nature, which is quite a lot, given that peatlands only represent about 3% of the world's surface, and many of those peatlands are intact. And about, if I remember correctly, 63% of that potential is actions to avoid further conversion and degradation of peatlands, whereas the remainder is about restoration of peatlands that have already been degraded, often through drainage. Pretty much all of that potential, unlike the talk we were hearing earlier, is about emissions reductions. So either avoiding emissions from damaging peatland that's currently intact, or restoring peatlands in a way that prevents the emissions that we do see very rapidly from drained peatlands. And the Global Peatland Initiative has made some recommendations, a few of which are represented here, on what we need to do to look after our peatlands with climate in particular in mind. And the first and most important one is to keep carbon in the ground, because as we've heard, peatlands are very rich carbon stocks. Regardless of what the above ground vegetation looks like, the carbon stocks in the soil are unique, and we need to safeguard those from ongoing conversion and degradation. And where there has been drainage, in order to prevent further emissions either from oxidation of the peat as microorganisms get into the dry peat soil and start to degrade it, or from fire, we do need to re-wet those drained peatlands, which is a real challenge if you've been using those peatlands for decades for agriculture. So, following the recommendations of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, we should be seeing wise use of peatlands regardless of what that kind of land use is. And in agricultural peatland, ideally that does mean restoring the hydrology and moving over to forms of wet agriculture, which are called paludiculture. So that could be biomass, it could be specific crops. And it really is, in many parts of the world, in quite an early stage. So there's lots of work to do to make sure that there's a good business case for this kind of agriculture. Where that's not possible, or where we're looking at transition, then we at least need to be increasing the water table, keeping the peatland as wet as possible, and reducing damaging activities, such as tillage. Always, this needs to be participative, so that the people that are involved, that have rights over resource rights over the lands, are involved and at least are consenting, hopefully are leading the way. And it requires strategic planning and coordination across sectors, so that peatlands are not being accidentally overlooked, say in infrastructure development plans. For peatlands, for nature-based solutions overall, there are existing safeguards that we can build on. And we need these clear social environmental safeguards to make sure that we are achieving those multiple benefits and avoiding accidental harms, and recognising and dealing with any of the trade-offs between, say, food security and climate change mitigation. IUCN has put forward a global standard for nature-based solutions, which explains this in quite some detail. As you can see, there are 8 principles with associated criteria, which are really like actions to undertake when you're planning and implementing nature-based solutions. And for specific ecosystems, we have a lot of experience. So in developing countries, forest sector, we have much experience in applying safeguards from RED+ that can be drawn upon to make sure we get this right. But if we're going to do any of this, we need investment. For nature-based solutions for mitigation, we know there's still quite a large gap in terms of finance available, and that requires action and coordination between both public and private sectors. And on the private sector side, the first responsibility is to reduce emissions within the value chains of whatever part of the private sector that is, including reducing emissions from land that private sector is responsible for. When that's done, if there are residual emissions, especially on a pathway to net zero by 2050, we might wish to think about offsetting through the use of nature-based solutions. I'm aware that that's a controversial area, but we feel that it can be part of a wider mitigation strategy, as long as we're getting the order of priorities right. And there are these initiatives and others are working on developing some rules and guidance in this area. So to conclude, we need urgent action on nature, whether that's within agricultural lands or more natural ecosystems. We need to make sure that the value and importance of nature is reflected in our economic and our political decision making, so that there's a stronger integration between the agendas for biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and human development. We feel that a failure to do this will absolutely exacerbate the problems of climate change, but nature-based solutions are also needed at scale to achieve the wide set of sustainable development goals. Without nature, we're nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lera Miles. And thank you for this very visual presentation with the maps showing sort of this overlap between the carbon stocks and also biodiversity. And I think this very slide is quite suitable to having here while we continue the discussion. And I'm now eager to hand the word to Ms. Annika Hirvonen, member of the Nordic Council. So what are your reflections and thoughts after having heard Dr. Weine and Dr. Miles here talking about this topic?
Yeah, I want to start in this picture. Stronger integration between biodiversity, climate and development agendas. I'm a member of parliament from Sweden, and in Sweden at the moment we have a big discussion on land use, especially when it comes to forestry, but I will touch upon some of these other issues as well. Could you bring me a glass of water, please?
Yes, of course.
Sorry. We have a highly industrialized forest industry as well as agricultural sector, and we for many decades, and still many do, pride ourselves with the sustainable forestry. But in fact, if you look at all of these parameters, it is still lacking. It is efficient in producing fiber, and thank you. And we do replant trees, but they are huge plantations that lack biodiversity. And the way they are managed, we also release a lot of carbon from the soil when harvesting trees. So there is a huge potential in this, but it will require a shift of paradigm. And actually today we presented a new package of policy on forestry, which is a compromise between my Green Party and those that maybe are more firmly rooted in the traditional or sort of mainstream forest use, but where we will be also taking steps both to preserve very important forest areas from a biodiversity perspective, and of course that way also keeping the coal binded in the forest, but also exploring new ways of forestry that release less carbon and that have more of these benefits. We also have, since several years, a national program for restoration of wetlands. So in order to have these, nature-based climate solutions, that's what we're talking about a lot. And what we can see is that they are very cost efficient. However, it's not as cost efficient everywhere. And there are conflicts, as you were saying, between agriculture that is farming that is now being done on these peatlands. For instance, in Sweden, we are self-sufficient in very few things. One of them is carrots. And most of our like organic carrot farming is done in these lands that would be ideal from this like peat wetland restoration point of view. And so I think it's key also what you say, that this has to be done together with the landowners, with the farmers, with the people in the local communities. And if done correctly, there are huge benefits also to be reaped. I mean, some of the wetlands that we have are very interesting tourist destinations, and ecotourism has really blossomed, and especially during COVID, because it's people traveling closer to home. So there are several societal benefits, but really we need to remember that we're facing a climate emergency and we're in the middle of a mass extinction. We have to present a solution and take action that integrate biodiversity, climate and development agendas. So thank you very much for the initiatives that both of you have been presenting here today.
Thank you for highlighting some of these sort of challenges or goal conflicts that we've seen when we talk about land and soil indeed. And also thank you for telling us about this forestry package. I think that's very interesting. I would now like to hand over to our final speaker for today, and we have Kristun Frostadottir, Member of Parliament in Iceland. What are your thoughts on this topic, now that you heard the two speakers and our two colleagues here on the stage?
So this is a very interesting topic for us coming from Iceland, because a large part of our emissions actually comes from peatlands that need to be restored, drained peatlands. And a lot of this is not discussed because it's not part of the common goal that we have here at COP. Actually, if you put it together, 2/3 of our emissions come from this. People don't often associate it with us because they don't look at Iceland as a big agricultural country. We don't have farming at huge scale. It seems very nature-based because we have free grazing, but free grazing is actually hurting the land. So there's a lot of things that sort of look natural to us that are not helping in terms of carbon emissions. So this was very interesting for me to hear, even though my background is not in the technical parts of this, but in the policy parts. I thought it was very interesting what Lisa said in the beginning regarding having a verification system, so you can actually show the farmers and also policymakers, the public, that you are tracking this. You can see that it's actually doing something. Because we can see here from all the discussions at COP regarding climate change that people, they want to see numbers, they want to see that we're moving somewhere. And if you want to engage these stakeholders, it's very important that we have something in hand. I think it's also very important that they have this discussion with the farmers, telling them this is also better for your soil, it's part of biodiversity, this is what is keeping us forward, to engage people. I also wanted to touch upon what was said here regarding grants and how we focus on agriculture in the EU, also in Iceland, because in Iceland we put the same amount of money into climate action as we do to farming subsidies. And these, so you could actually say that this is canceling each other out because the government is not pushing those subsidies in an eco-friendly manner. So we as politicians need to understand that there are things that we can directly do. Some people here at the conference have talked about market distortions. This is a perfect case of a market distortion that we're focusing on. And need to focus on. Sort of last points that I came across and I thought was interesting, obviously additional finance needed. Money makes the world go around. That's just how it is, right? We can't do any of this with farmers unless we tell them, listen, we're gonna make sure that your livelihoods are protected. We're not taking things away from you. We're helping you through this process. And I think this is a very important discussion that we need to make. Also to show in the private sector level that this is good business. So those were sort of my main takeaways, how you engage stakeholders, how we can work hand in hand with farmers and us as policymakers, make sure that we're not creating market distortions. We have more power than we think. And then I just want to add on a final note, because Annika talked about ecotourism. I come from a country of tourist boom. People come to see untouched nature. And for farming, this has been a big source of extra revenue for farmers that they can use part of their farms as a guest house. You have ecosystem farming, you come, you know, and look how things are done on the farm. We need to give people a broader variety of income, and so they can see, like I said, a good business case for participating in this. So thank you very much. This was very insightful.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kristin Frostadottir. And thank you also for touching upon something I know is important in all of these different initiatives, and how to provide these economic incentives to keep these actions moving. I would like to bring a warm thank you to all of the speakers engaging, and also to all our participants for listening into this, both online and here in the Nordic Pavilion. If you are curious and want to learn more about this topic and engaging it, one way would be to enter the Nordic Forest Research or the Nordic Agri Research websites, and there are several webinars and policy briefs, etc. you could take part of. So thank you so much for listening, and I wish you a nice rest of the day.